My farm burned down on a Tuesday night in late October. By Wednesday morning, my own family was calling me homeless. I still remember the smell of smoke in my hair as I stood on the gravel road, staring at what used to be my house. The fire trucks had already left. The flashing lights were gone. All that remained was a black skeleton of beams where the farmhouse had stood for nearly 40 years. The wind carried thin gray ash across the empty fields. I had built that life with my husband, and in a single night it was gone. But losing the house wasn't the part that broke me. What broke me was what my family said the next day. Before I tell you what happened after that, I want to say something first. I'm glad you're here. Follow my story until the end, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I always wonder how far these stories travel. Now let me take you back to that morning. I was 68 years old when the fire took the farm. For most people, 68 means slowing down. Retirement. Grandchildren. Quiet mornings with coffee on the porch. But life on a farm doesn't really work that way. Even after my husband Walter passed away 6 years earlier, I kept the place running myself. It wasn't easy, but it was mine. The Harper farm sat on just over 120 acres outside a small town in Kansas. Wheat fields stretched out behind the barn, and a row of old cottonwood trees lined the dirt road that led to the highway. Walter and I bought the land when we were barely in our 30s. Back then, the house was a small white structure with a sagging porch and a roof that leaked every spring. We fixed it slowly, one room at a time. Walter built the back deck with his own hands. I planted the garden beside the kitchen window. Over the years we added a bigger barn, a new tractor shed, and a long fence that ran along the pasture where our horses used to graze. That farm held every chapter of our lives. It held our arguments, our laughter, our dreams. It held the day we brought our son home from the hospital, and the day we buried Walter on the hill behind the oak trees. After he died, people kept asking if I planned to sell, but I never even considered it. The farm wasn't just property. It was the only home I had ever known. The night of the fire started quietly. Too quietly. It was just after 11 p.m. when I noticed the light outside my bedroom window. First I thought it was lightning. Then I smelled the smoke. By the time I opened the door, flames were already crawling up the side of the equipment shed. Fire spreads faster than people realize, especially on a farm. There's dry wood, old hay, gasoline for tractors. Within minutes the shed was an inferno. I called 911 with shaking hands while grabbing my coat and boots. The dispatcher kept asking if anyone else was inside. No, I told her. Just me. The fire department arrived 15 minutes later, but by then the flames had already reached the house. I stood across the road watching them fight it, watching the roof collapse, watching 40 years disappear in smoke. One of the firefighters placed a blanket around my shoulders. "Ma'am," he said gently, "I'm sorry. I didn't cry. Not then. I just kept staring at the ruins." The next morning my son came. Ethan arrived just after sunrise with his wife Claire. They lived about 30 minutes away in a newer neighborhood outside Wichita. I hadn't seen them in almost 3 weeks. When their SUV pulled into the gravel drive, I felt a small wave of relief. Family was here. I thought they had come to help. Claire stepped out first. She was wearing a long beige coat and sunglasses, even though the sky was gray with leftover smoke. Ethan hugged me briefly. "You okay, Mom?" he asked. His voice sounded distracted, like he was already thinking about something else. "I'm fine," I said, though my throat felt raw from the smoke. We walked toward what remained of the house. Charred beams stuck out of the ground like broken bones. Claire looked around the property, her eyes moving slowly across the burned structure. "Well," she said finally, "that's unfortunate." Unfortunate. That was the word she chose for the place where my entire life had stood 12 hours earlier. I tried not to react. People say strange things when they're uncomfortable. That's what I told myself. Later that afternoon we sat inside Ethan's SUV because the wind was too cold outside. The heater hummed quietly. I was wrapped in the blanket the firefighters had given me. For a while no one spoke. Then Claire finally broke the silence. "So," she said, turning toward Ethan, "we should probably talk about what happens next." I assumed she meant rebuilding. Or maybe temporary housing. Before I could say anything, Ethan cleared his throat. "Mom," he said carefully, "the house is gone." I blinked. "Yes," I said slowly. "I can see that." He shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I mean, you don't really have a place to live now." The words hung in the air. Claire leaned forward slightly. "You're basically homeless at the moment," she said. Homeless. The word hit me harder than the fire had. I looked at her, unsure if I'd heard correctly. "Excuse me," I said quietly. Claire didn't seem embarrassed. If anything, she looked practical. "Well, technically that's what it is," she said. "You don't have a house anymore." Ethan avoided my eyes. "Claire's just saying we need to figure out the next step," he murmured. For a moment I couldn't speak. I had expected sympathy, concern, maybe even comfort. Instead I was being discussed like a logistical problem, a situation that needed solving. Claire continued talking. "There's a nice assisted living place about 10 miles from our neighborhood," she said. "My coworker's mother moved there last year." Assisted living. I stared at her. "I'm not moving into a nursing home," I said. "Oh, it's not a nursing home," she replied quickly. "It's a senior community. Very modern." I turned to Ethan. "You agree with this?" I asked. He hesitated. "Well, Mom," he said slowly, "the farm is gone." The way he said it made my stomach tighten. Gone. As if the land itself had disappeared. But the land was still there. 120 acres of it. Burned buildings didn't erase property. And suddenly a strange thought crossed my mind. Why were they acting like the entire farm had vanished? Why were they talking about moving me out, when the land still belonged to me? I didn't say anything then. I just nodded slowly. But something deep inside me shifted. Because in that moment, sitting in the back seat of my son's SUV, I realized something that made the cold wind outside feel even colder. The fire might have destroyed my house. But something else was burning beneath the surface of my own family. And I had a feeling that fire didn't start by accident. The first night after the fire, I slept in Ethan and Claire's guest room. I didn't bring much with me. Just a small duffel bag the firefighters had helped me pack from what little survived in the truck. 2 sweaters. A pair of jeans. My husband's old pocket watch. That was all that remained of 40 years inside that house. Claire showed me the room quickly, like she was checking something off a list. "The bathroom is down the hall," she said. "Breakfast is usually around 7, but Ethan leaves early for work." Then she paused in the doorway. "Oh, and try not to track mud through the house." Mud. I had spent my entire life living on a farm. Mud had always been part of it. But I just nodded. "Of course," I said. When the door closed, the room became very quiet. Their house felt different from mine. Too clean. Too still. The air smelled like scented candles instead of hay and soil. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time. The fire kept replaying in my mind. The flames. The collapsing roof. The sound of wood snapping in the heat. But what stayed with me even more were Claire's words. "You're basically homeless." The word felt strange in my chest. Homeless. It didn't make sense. The house was gone, yes. But the farm was still there. 120 acres of land. Walter and I had paid that mortgage off nearly 20 years ago. So why were they already talking about nursing homes and senior communities? I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning I woke up early out of habit. Farm life trains your body that way. Sunrise means work. Even when there's no farm left to work. The house was quiet when I walked into the kitchen. I made myself a cup of coffee and stood by the window looking out at their backyard. Perfect grass. Perfect fence. Not a single weed anywhere. Claire came downstairs about 20 minutes later. She stopped when she saw me standing there. "Oh," she said, sounding surprised. "You're up." "I've always been an early riser," I replied. She opened the refrigerator and took out a carton of almond milk. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then she said something that made my stomach tighten. "So, Ethan and I were talking last night." I turned slightly toward her. "About what?" I asked. She closed the refrigerator door and leaned against the counter. "About the farm," she said. "Not the fire. Not my house. The farm." And the way she said it made it sound less like concern, and more like a business conversation. That was the moment I began to realize something. Maybe the fire hadn't only destroyed my home. Maybe it had also revealed what my family had really been thinking all along. Claire poured almond milk into her coffee slowly, like she had rehearsed what she was about to say. The farm is a lot to handle, she continued. Even before the fire. I watched her carefully. What do you mean? I asked. She shrugged lightly. Well, maintaining land like that takes money. Repairs. Equipment. Insurance. It's not really practical anymore. Practical. That word again. Before I could respond, Ethan walked into the kitchen, still adjusting the cuffs of his work shirt. Morning, he said, grabbing a mug from the cabinet. Morning, I replied. He glanced between Claire and me, sensing the tension. Claire didn't wait long. We were just talking about the farm, she told him. Ethan sighed quietly, like he already knew where the conversation was heading. Mom, he said, sitting at the table. Maybe it's time to think about selling. The sentence landed heavier than I expected. Selling. Walter and I had spent 40 years building that place. Every fence post. Every barn door. Every tree along the driveway. Selling the land? I asked slowly. Claire nodded as if the idea were obvious. It's probably worth a lot, she said. Especially now. That last part made me pause. Especially now. What do you mean by that? I asked. She leaned forward slightly, resting her elbows on the counter. Well, she said, the house is already gone. Rebuilding would cost a fortune. Ethan nodded. And insurance will cover most of the loss anyway. My fingers tightened slightly around the coffee mug. Insurance. There it was again. The same word Ethan had mentioned the day before. I set the mug down carefully. What insurance? I asked. Ethan looked up. The farm policy, he said. You've had coverage for years. I shook my head slowly. No, I said. I canceled the policy 3 years ago. The kitchen went quiet. Claire's expression froze for a split second. Cancelled, she repeated. Yes, I said. The premiums kept going up, and after Walter died I decided to save the money. Ethan frowned. That's strange. Why? I asked. He hesitated. Well, I just assumed the fire would be covered. Covered. Claire quickly stepped in. Well, regardless, she said smoothly, the land itself is still extremely valuable. She said the word valuable the same way someone might talk about stock or real estate. Not memories. Not history. Just numbers. I watched them both carefully then. The conversation had shifted too easily. Too quickly. Almost like they had expected the fire to solve a problem for them. And suddenly a quiet question formed in the back of my mind. If they were so certain about insurance money, then what exactly had they been planning all along? That conversation stayed with me all day. Not because of what Claire said, but because of what Ethan said without realizing it. Insurance will cover most of the loss anyway. The sentence kept repeating in my head. I had canceled the policy 3 years earlier. I remembered the phone call clearly. The agent had tried to convince me to keep it, but the premiums had climbed too high after Walter died. And I needed every dollar I had to keep the farm running. So how could Ethan be so sure the fire would be covered? That night I lay awake in the guest room again, staring at the ceiling. The house was quiet. Too quiet. Around midnight I heard soft footsteps in the hallway outside my door. Claire's voice drifted through the wall. She can't stay here forever, she whispered. Ethan answered, but his voice was lower. I know. There was a pause. Then Claire spoke again. If the land sells, everything gets easier. I held my breath. The land sells. Not rebuild. Not help Mom recover. Sell. I closed my eyes but sleep never came. The next morning I told Ethan I wanted to go back to the farm. Just to look around, I said. He hesitated. Mom. There's nothing there anymore. I know, I replied. But it's still my land. After a moment he handed me the keys to his truck. The drive back felt longer than usual. When I turned onto the dirt road leading to the property, the first thing I noticed was the smell. Burned wood has a scent that stays for days. Maybe weeks. The farmhouse was exactly as I had left it. Blackened beams. Collapsed roof. Ash scattered across the yard like gray snow. I walked slowly toward what used to be the equipment shed. That was where the fire had started. At least that's what the firefighters told me. I stood there quietly looking at the ground. Something didn't feel right. Farm fires usually start from faulty wiring or old machinery. But the shed had been empty that night. The tractor was parked in the barn. And the generator had been shut off for weeks. I took a few steps closer and noticed something strange in the dirt. Dark stains near the corner of the concrete slab. I crouched down slowly. The smell hit me immediately. Gasoline. Old, faint but unmistakable. I straightened up and looked around the burned field. A cold feeling moved through my chest. Because gasoline doesn't just appear in the dirt by accident. Someone had brought it there. And in that moment, standing in the ashes of my own farm, a quiet realization began to form. Maybe the fire hadn't been an accident at all. I stood there for a long time, staring at the dark stain in the dirt. Gasoline. The smell was faint, but once you've spent enough years around farm equipment, you learn to recognize it instantly. And this wasn't coming from a tractor. The shed had been empty that night. No fuel cans. No machinery. Nothing that should have leaked. The wind moved softly through the burned frame of the building, carrying bits of ash across the ground. For a moment I told myself I was imagining things. Fires are chaotic. After something like that, your mind starts trying to make patterns out of destruction. Still, the smell lingered. I took a few steps around the edge of the concrete slab where the shed had stood. The dirt near the back corner looked darker than the rest. Almost like something had soaked into it before the fire started. A slow chill crept down my spine. Because gasoline doesn't just spill itself in the middle of an empty shed. Someone had brought it there. I was still standing there when a pickup truck rolled slowly down the dirt road. It was one of the county fire department trucks. The same department that had come out the night before. The driver pulled to a stop beside the fence. When the door opened, I recognized him immediately. Deputy Fire Chief Martin Alvarez. He'd been with the department for nearly 20 years. Tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of calm voice people trust during emergencies. He walked toward me, boots crunching over the gravel. "Mrs. Harper," he said gently. "Thought I might find you out here." I gave a small nod. "I couldn't stay away," I admitted. He looked toward the burned structure. "Hard thing to see," he said. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then his eyes moved down to the ground near where I had been standing. "You notice the smell?" he asked quietly. My heart skipped. "So it's not just me," I said. He shook his head slowly. "No," he crouched down and brushed some ash away with his glove. "Truth is," he continued, "we found traces of an accelerant during the initial sweep last night." Accelerant. The word settled heavily in the air between us. "You mean gasoline?" I asked. "Possibly," he said. "But we'll need a full investigation to confirm." I felt my chest tighten. So the fire wasn't accidental? Martin stood up again, dusting his hands off. "It's too early to say for certain," he replied carefully. "But I can tell you this." He looked directly at me then. Fires that start with accelerants usually don't start themselves. The wind moved across the empty field again. And suddenly the quiet farm didn't feel like home anymore. Felt like a crime scene. And the worst part was the thought that came next. Because if someone had deliberately started that fire, then the question wasn't just why. The question was who. Martin's words followed me all the way back to Ethan's house. Fires that start with accelerants usually don't start themselves. The sentence kept echoing in my head during the entire drive. I had lived on that farm for nearly 40 years. I had seen lightning strikes hit barns. I had seen old wiring spark inside grain silos. Farm accidents happen. But gasoline poured onto the ground? That wasn't an accident. That was a decision. When I pulled into Ethan's driveway, Claire's car was already there. She worked from home most days. Something about marketing for a real estate company in Wichita. Real estate. Funny how certain details start to matter once your mind begins asking the right questions. I stepped inside quietly. Claire was sitting at the kitchen island with her laptop open. She looked up when she saw me. "Oh," she said. "You went back to the farm?" "Yes." "How bad is it?" I hung my coat by the door. "About the same as yesterday," I replied. She nodded slowly but didn't ask anything else. Not about the investigation. Not about the cause of the fire. Just silence. That struck me as strange. If someone's house burns down, most people ask questions. They want to know what happened. Claire didn't seem curious at all. Later that evening, Ethan came home from work. We ate dinner quietly at the table. Claire talked about something related to a property listing she was trying to close. Ethan nodded while scrolling through his phone. Neither of them mentioned the farm. Finally, I decided to say something. I spoke with Deputy Chief Alvarez today, I said. Ethan looked up. Oh, they found traces of gasoline where the fire started. Claire's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. Just for a moment. Then she set it down. Well, she said carefully, there's gasoline all over farms. Not in an empty shed, I replied. Ethan leaned back in his chair. So they think someone started it? He asked. They're investigating. Another silence filled the room. Claire picked up her water glass. Either way, she said calmly, that property is probably a total loss now. Total loss. The words felt too quick. Too certain. I looked at Ethan. Did you ever talk to anyone about selling the farm? I asked. He frowned. No, Mom. Why would I? I studied his face carefully, trying to see if anything there felt dishonest. But Ethan had always been a terrible liar. If he was hiding something, it would show. Claire stood up and began clearing plates. Well, she said lightly, with the house gone, rebuilding might not make sense financially. There it was again. Not if the farm should be rebuilt. But why it shouldn't. And as I sat there watching my daughter-in-law move calmly around the kitchen, a new thought quietly formed in the back of my mind. If someone had set that fire on purpose, then maybe the real target hadn't been the house. Maybe the real target had been the land. That night I couldn't stop thinking about Claire's words. Asterisk. That property is probably a total loss now. Asterisk, not the house. Not the barn. The property. Land. Claire had always talked about things that way. Like numbers on paper. Like square footage and market value. Which made sense considering her job. But something about the way she said it that night felt different. Too certain. The next morning I woke up earlier than usual. The sky outside Ethan's kitchen window was still gray with dawn. Old habits die hard when you've spent most of your life on a farm. My body still expected chores at sunrise. But now there were no animals to feed. No fences to check. Just silence. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat at the table. For a long time I stared at the steam rising from the mug. Then another memory drifted into my mind. Something Claire had mentioned a few weeks before the fire. We had been sitting on the porch at the farm. She had come out with Ethan one Sunday afternoon. Claire had been scrolling through something on her phone when she looked up at the fields. You know, she had said casually, land out here is getting more valuable every year. I remember smiling politely. Farming land always has value, I told her. But she shook her head. I don't mean farming, she said. I mean development. Development. The word sounded strange back then. This was rural Kansas. Miles of wheat fields. Old barns. Gravel roads. Not exactly the kind of place people rush to build houses. But Claire kept talking. My company's been tracking expansion from Wichita, she explained. Investors are buying land farther and farther outside the city. She pointed toward the highway in the distance. In 10 years, this area could look completely different. At the time I hadn't thought much about it. People speculate about land all the time. But sitting in Ethan's kitchen that morning, the memory felt heavier. Because suddenly I remembered something else she had said that day. Something small. Something I hadn't paid attention to before. Claire had looked out over the fields and asked, has anyone ever offered to buy the farm? I had laughed. Every few years someone asks, I told her. And every time I tell them the same thing. What's that? She asked. That it's not for sale. Claire didn't argue. She just nodded slowly. But now, remembering the look in her eyes that afternoon, I realized something that made my stomach tighten. She hadn't asked that question out of curiosity. She had asked it like someone studying an opportunity. And if Claire believed the farm was worth far more than I realized, then the fire might not have been about destroying my house. It might have been about clearing the land. For the rest of that morning, I kept thinking about the conversation Claire and I had on the porch. Land out here is getting more valuable every year. At the time I hadn't taken it seriously. Farmers hear that kind of talk all the time. Investors, developers, city people looking for cheap acreage. Most of it never goes anywhere. But now the pieces in my mind were starting to move. The fire. The gasoline smell. Claire talking about selling the land almost immediately. It all felt connected. Still, suspicion isn't proof. And I needed proof before I started accusing anyone of something that serious. That afternoon I decided to do something simple. I drove into town. Our town wasn't very big. One grocery store, a hardware shop, a diner that had been there longer than I had. But it also had one thing that farms like mine rely on. An insurance office. The same one Walter and I had used for nearly 30 years. The sign outside still read Parker and Wells Farm Insurance. When I walked inside, the receptionist recognized me immediately. "Mrs. Harper," she said softly. "I heard about the fire." "I'm so sorry." "Thank you," I replied. She led me to the back office where Tom Parker was sitting behind his desk. Tom had handled our policies for years. He stood up when he saw me. "Mary," he said gently. "I was meaning to call you." I sat down slowly. "I just have a question," I told him. "Did anyone contact this office about my farm insurance recently?" Tom frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" "Any calls? Any inquiries? Anything like that?" He turned toward his computer and typed for a moment. Then he leaned back in his chair. "Well, that's strange." My heart tightened. "What is?" I asked. Tom looked at the screen again. "About 2 weeks ago someone called asking about reinstating your old policy." Reinstating. The word made my pulse quicken. "Who called?" I asked quietly. He scrolled through the notes. It says the caller identified herself as Claire Harper. My chest went cold. Claire. And what did she want exactly? I asked. Tom read from the screen. She asked if the policy could be reactivated quickly in case of unexpected damage to the property. The office suddenly felt smaller. Quieter. "And did you reinstate it?" I asked. Tom shook his head. "No. We can't reactivate a policy without the property owner signing the paperwork." I nodded slowly, but inside my mind, something had just shifted. Because Claire hadn't just been talking about selling the farm. 2 weeks before the fire, she had tried to put insurance back on it. And suddenly one terrifying possibility began to take shape. What if someone had planned the fire, but the insurance part of the plan had failed? I sat in Tom Parker's office for a long moment after he said Claire's name. The room suddenly felt very quiet. 2 weeks before the fire, my daughter-in-law had called the insurance office. Not to ask about rebuilding. Not to ask about coverage after the fire. But to reinstate the policy before anything happened. Tom was still looking at the screen. "Do you want a copy of the call record?" he asked. "Yes," I said. My voice sounded calm, even though my chest felt tight. He printed the page and slid it across the desk. The note was short. Caller. Claire Harper. Subject. Policy reinstatement inquiry reason. Possible property damage concerns possible property damage. I folded the paper carefully and slipped it into my purse. "Thank you, Tom," I said. As I stood up, he studied my face for a moment. "Mary," he said quietly, "is everything all right?" I forced a small smile. "I'm just trying to understand what happened." He nodded slowly. "Well," he said, "if you need any documentation for the investigation, just let me know." Investigation. The word followed me all the way out to the parking lot. The drive back to Ethan's house felt longer than usual. The fields along the highway rolled past my window in long waves of gold and brown. Normally those drives calmed me, but not that day, because now the questions in my mind had grown heavier. Claire had tried to put insurance back on the farm. 2 weeks later, the equipment shed burned, and the very next day she was already talking about selling the land. Too many pieces were lining up. Too neatly. When I pulled into Ethan's driveway that afternoon, Claire's car was gone. Ethan's truck was in the garage though. He must have come home early. I walked inside and found him sitting in the living room scrolling through something on his phone. "Hey Mom," he said. "Where do you go today?" "Into town," I replied. He nodded. "Anything interesting?" I set my purse down on the kitchen counter. Then I looked at him carefully. "Did Claire ever talk to you about the farm insurance?" I asked. He frowned. What insurance? The policy I canceled 3 years ago. He shook his head. No, why? I studied his expression. Ethan had never been very good at hiding things, and right now he looked genuinely confused. She called the insurance office 2 weeks ago, I said. His head lifted quickly. She did what? To ask about reinstating the policy. The room went quiet. Ethan stared at me. Then he slowly leaned back against the couch. That's weird, he said. Yes, I replied softly. It is. And in that moment, watching the confusion on my son's face, I realized something important. If Claire had been planning something with the insurance, Ethan might not have known about it at all, which meant the person behind the fire might not be my son, but it might still be someone inside my family. Ethan didn't say much after that conversation. He just sat there on the couch, staring at the floor like he was trying to work through something in his head. Why would Claire call the insurance office? He asked after a moment. I was hoping you could tell me, I replied. He rubbed his forehead slowly. She never mentioned anything about that. I believed him. Ethan had always been easy to read. When he lied as a boy, his ears turned red and his voice got tight. Right now he just looked confused, and maybe a little worried. That evening Claire came home later than usual. Her heels clicked across the kitchen floor when she walked in, carrying her laptop bag over one shoulder. Hi, she said casually when she saw us. Ethan looked up. Claire, he said. Mom talked to the insurance office today. For a second, just a second, something flickered across her face. Then it disappeared. Oh, she said lightly. Yes, I said. They told me you called 2 weeks ago asking about reinstating the farm policy. The room fell quiet. Claire set her bag on the counter. Well, yes, she admitted after a moment. I was just exploring options. Options? Ethan repeated. Claire crossed her arms. Ethan, your mother lives alone on a rural property, she said. I thought it was irresponsible that the place wasn't insured. I watched her carefully. The explanation sounded reasonable. Maybe too reasonable. You didn't think to ask me first? I said. Claire shrugged. I was trying to help. Ethan looked between us. But why 2 weeks ago? He asked. Claire hesitated. I don't remember exactly, she said. Maybe I had just been thinking about worst-case scenarios. Worst-case scenarios. The words hung in the air. Then she changed the subject quickly. Anyway, she said, walking toward the refrigerator, none of that matters now. The house is gone. Gone. Again she said it like the land itself had vanished. Later that night, after everyone had gone to bed, I sat alone at the kitchen table. The house was dark except for the small light above the stove. In front of me sat the paper Tom Parker had printed for me. Caller. Claire Harper. Date 2 weeks before the fire. Asterisk asterisk I read it again. And again. Something about the timing bothered me. 2 weeks before the fire she had tried to activate insurance. Then the fire happened. But the policy never went through. Which meant whoever planned it had made a mistake. I folded the paper slowly, because now another thought had begun forming in my mind. If Claire expected insurance money from that fire, then she must have believed the farm would burn. And if someone believes something like that ahead of time, sometimes it's because they already know exactly when it will happen. That night I didn't sleep. I sat at the kitchen table long after the house had gone quiet, the paper from Tom Parker still in front of me. 2 weeks before the fire. Claire had tried to activate insurance on the farm, but the policy had never gone through, which meant whoever planned it had expected something different to happen. Insurance money. That had been the plan. Only the paperwork had failed. And now, the house was gone but there was no payout coming. I folded the paper slowly and slipped it back into my purse, because at that moment one thing became clear. If the fire had been planned, the person responsible might start acting differently now that the plan had failed. All I had to do was watch. The next morning started quietly. Claire was already dressed for work when I walked into the kitchen. She was standing at the counter scrolling through her phone. Morning, she said without looking up. Morning. I poured myself coffee and sat down. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then Claire sighed. I spoke with a developer yesterday, she said casually. The word caught my attention immediately. A developer? I asked. Yes, she said. About the farm. There it was again. The farm. Not the fire. Not rebuilding. Just the land. What developer? I asked. An investment group from Wichita, she replied. They're expanding west. She said it like it was normal conversation, like we were discussing the weather. They're very interested in large properties near the highway, she continued. My hands tightened slightly around the mug. The highway. The same highway Claire had pointed to weeks earlier while talking about development. And what does that have to do with my farm? I asked quietly. Claire finally looked up. Well, she said, without the house there anymore, the land becomes much easier to redevelop. Easier. The word sat heavy in the room. Ethan walked into the kitchen just then, still half asleep. What are we talking about? He asked. Claire answered before I could. Just potential buyers for the property. Ethan frowned. Buyers? Claire shrugged. It's just a conversation. But something about her tone made my stomach twist. Because it didn't sound like a casual idea. It sounded like a plan that had already been moving forward. And suddenly another possibility crossed my mind. What if Claire hadn't been acting alone? What if someone else already knew about the farm's value? Someone who stood to gain if the land was cleared and sold? Because if developers had already been asking questions, then the fire might not have just been about insurance. It might have been about something much bigger than my house. It might have been about 120 acres of land sitting in the path of a growing city. Claire's words stayed with me. The rest of that day. Without the house there anymore. The land becomes much easier to redevelop. Easier. Like the fire had solved a problem. But Claire didn't realize something important. She wasn't the only one asking questions anymore. 3 days later, Deputy Chief Martin Alvarez called me. Mrs. Harper, he said. We've finished the lab analysis. My heart started beating faster. And? I asked. The accelerant was gasoline, he said. And we found something else. What? A security camera. I frowned. Where? At Miller's gas station. About 6 miles from your farm. The same gas station everyone in town used. What did the camera show? I asked quietly. Martin paused for a moment. Your daughter-in-law's car, he said. 2 nights before the fire. The investigation moved quickly after that. Claire tried to explain it away at first. She said she had bought gasoline for yard equipment. But there was one problem. Her car had never come back to Ethan's house that night. The highway camera outside town showed it turning onto the county road toward the farm. The same road that led to my equipment shed. When the sheriff finally confronted her with the footage, the story fell apart. The plan had been simple. Reinstate the insurance. Burn the shed. Collect the payout. Then convince Ethan to sell the land to developers already interested in the property. But the insurance policy never went through. And the fire destroyed more than she intended. Instead of making money, she had only exposed everything. A week later, Claire moved out of Ethan's house. The legal investigation was still ongoing. But one thing was already clear. The farm wasn't going anywhere. Because the land had always been mine. And Ethan, once he finally understood what had happened, stood beside me for the first time in months. I'm sorry, Mom, he said one evening as we stood together on the hill behind the burned house. The same hill where Walter was buried. I should have seen it sooner. I looked out across the fields. The wheat would grow again next season. Farms always recover. That's the quiet promise land makes to the people who care for it. We'll rebuild, Ethan said. I nodded slowly. Yes, I replied. Because the fire had taken my house. But it hadn't taken the farm. And it certainly hadn't taken the life Walter and I had built here. The sun set over the fields that evening. The wind moved gently across the empty land. And for the first time since the fire, the farm finally felt like home again.